Hello. So I work for the Extended Knowledge project at the philosophy department, where my colleagues and I are trying to figure out what are all the possible ways in which technology in society might affect the way we acquire knowledge. And today I will be talking about those aspects of our research that are concerned with what are the effects of society on epistemology, which in general is a field of philosophy that studies the concept of knowledge and related concepts like justification. So if I use the word epistemology, this is what I refer to. I will be talking about group knowledge. And what I will do is, first of all, I will explain what group knowledge is by referring to two underlying hypotheses in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Then I will give you two examples of group knowledge within philosophy of science and cognitive psychology. And finally, I will also give you one example from web science, what web scientists call social machines. And I will conclude by explaining how thinking about group knowledge can solve a problem with one of the most famous social machines, which is the case of Wikipedia. So, group knowledge is the idea that there can be groups that can acquire knowledge in the same way that we acquire knowledge within our own heads. So I should be clear that I'm not interested in group knowledge as being the sum total of knowledge possessed by the individual members of the group, but as knowledge produced by the group as a whole. And I will give you several examples later on, but just so that you can visualize what I'm on about. One good case of group knowledge is the kind of knowledge that's produced by scientific research teams where several scientists come together, they collaborate, interact, and so they produce a research output that none of them could have produced were they to be doing research on their own. Now, the starting point, if we really want to think about what group knowledge is two sister hypotheses from philosophy of mind and cognitive science. The first one is the extended cognition hypothesis, which says that sometimes when we interact with technology like smartphones, pen and paper, telescopes, and I'll give you more examples soon, then we can say that our cognitive systems, they're not only bound within our heads, but they might extend to the artifacts that we employ. And similarly, the distributed cognition hypothesis says that when we interact with other individuals, then we might say that the cognitive system does not only extend to the involved artifacts, but it might be distributed between several individuals at the same time. Now, there are several ways to understand what those hypotheses amount to, and several ways to motivate them, but I think that the most promising and informative one comes from dynamical systems theory, which is the branch of mathematics that Newton introduced in order to account for his mechanics, and which is used all over science across several disciplines ever since. And the reason why I think that dynamical systems theory is very helpful when we try to understand where we have the word integrated, extended, or distributed cognitive system is because it says that whenever we have several distinct parts, if we want to claim that those distinct parts give rise to an overall system that consists of all of them at the same time, then what we need to do is to make sure that they are non-linearly related on the basis of mutual interactions between them. And the reason why those mutual interactions are very important is first because they give rise to new systemic properties that do not belong to any of the underlying components, but to their ongoing interaction, which obviously belongs to the overall system. And so if we want to account for those new systemic properties, we have to postulate the overall system. And at the same time, those nonlinear relations also make it impossible to decompose the overall system in terms of distinct inputs and outputs from the one component to the other. The reason being that the behavior of each component is simultaneously dependent on the behavior of all the other components. And so if we want to understand why they behave the way they behave, then we won't be able to postulate the overall system. So this is why nonlinear relations are important when we try to judge whether we have an integrated, extended, or distributed system. And to see how this criteria might be applied now, in the case of cognitive extension, it means that we cannot really go on and claim that our memories are extended every time we use a directory service or a phone book, in the sense that we can know the phone numbers of everyone whose number is listed. The reason being that every time we use such artifacts, we are only one way related to them. We just receive information from the artifact, but we don't do anything to the artifact in return. And so there are no mutual interactions, and so they won't qualify as cases of cognitive extension. And neither will be shopping lists, which is again very similar, only this time we create the list in order to use it at some later point. But again, crucially, during the process of retrieval, we don't interact with the list. Instead, we just read from it. We're only affected one way, and it won't qualify as a case of cognitive extension. There are, however, other cases that will qualify, and I think that the most interesting one to begin with is the case of the tactile visual substitution systems, which are a pair of sunglasses that have attached to them a mini video camera which converts the visual input into tactile stimulation under the agent's tongue or on their forehead. And the agent, by moving around and interacting with the device, affecting the kind of input he will receive, he starts perceiving shapes and objects, and they orient themselves in space. And so we can claim that the cognitive ability of perceiving the world is extended beyond the blind person's brain to the artifact that he's interacting with. And similarly, we can say very similar things in the much lower tech case of the blind man and his cane. And the same goes for microscopes, telescopes. And there is this other very interesting case of the magnetic belt, where subjects, they perceive the direction of the magnetic north as vibrations around their waist. And after a while, they also report that they can perceive magnetic north as an object that is distinct out there in space, in the same way that we perceive the objects of our visual perception as not just as stimulation on our retinas, but as objects out there. And other similar cases where we mutually interact with the artifact, plausibly is the case of Google glasses, of course our laptops, pen and paper when we try to solve complex mathematical problems, for instance, or when we draw. And so all these are cases that, by the lines of dynamical systems theory, will qualify as cases of cognitive extension. And similarly to the case of distributed cognition, we won't be able to say that we have a distributed cognitive system every time we ask for directions from a stranger. Again, because we just receive the information from the stranger, the content of the information we receive doesn't really have to do with us, and so it's only a linear relation between the one individual and the other. And the same goes for cases of testimony. So these are cases that won't qualify, but there are other cases like brainstorming, as I mentioned, scientific research teams, plausibly jazz bands, improvising. And also there are examples from that do not include individual agents, but they include insects, and they are known as swarm intelligence, and are actually the inspiration behind distributed cognition. Now, to see how this is related to the idea of knowledge, which is traditionally thought to amount to justified true belief, the connecting point is a long-standing epistemological problem, which is how we can be justified on the basis of processes that we don't really know how they work or why they're reliable. Traditionally, justification is thought to amount to some ability we have to provide positive reasons in favor of our beliefs. But there are also processes on which we take ourselves to know that we don't really know how they work. For instance, think about visual perception or memory. Everyone would like to say that we know on their basis, but no one, not even scientists, really know why they work and how they work and why they are reliable. So that's a problem that has puzzled epistemologists for a long time, but recently it has been suggested that maybe one way to solve this problem is to say that justification is the same as cognitive integration, or to think about justification in terms of cognitive integration, which, just as in the case of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, is supposed to be thought as a function of cooperation and interaction, or cooperative interaction with other aspects of the cognitive system. And the idea is that if a process is interconnected in this way with the rest of the agent's cognitive system, then it can be continuously monitored in the background, such that if there is something wrong with it, then the agent will spot it and respond appropriately. Otherwise, if there is nothing wrong, the agent can be by default justified in employing the process and accepting its results without even having any beliefs about it or positive reasons as to whether it is reliable or why it might be reliable. So that's how thinking about justification in terms of cognitive integration solves the problem of how to justify ourselves in cases where we have no positive reasons to offer in favor of our beliefs. But the main point I want to make is that if this is how we should be thinking about justification in terms of cognitive integration that arises out of mutual interactions between the relevant processes, then it seems that we can go on and claim that justification can be distributed between several individuals at the same time, provided that those individuals give rise to a distributed cognitive system on the basis of processes of cooperation and interaction and cooperative interaction. In other words, since mutual interactions is a criterion by which we can judge whether a system is both cognitively and epistemically justified, integrated, then we can claim that there can be epistemic group agents that can give rise to group knowledge in the sense that the justification is distributed between all of them at the same time. Now you might say this is an interesting idea, but it's inconsequential because there are no such real-life cases. But as I mentioned, there are several philosophers of science and ethnographers of science who suggest that on many occasions, if we want to understand the knowledge produced by scientific research teams, we should approach it in terms of distributed cognition and something very similar to what I have been referring to as group knowledge. And then a very interesting case is also the case of transactive memory systems within cognitive psychology, which are supposed to be groups of two or more individuals that collaboratively store, encode, and retrieve information. And just to give you an example, think about an old couple that we ask them where did they get a souvenir from, and the husband says in the beginning that he cannot really remember because it must have been more than 20 years ago. And that makes the wife say something like it must have been during the honeymoon, which then makes the husband say something else, which then makes the wife say something else, and so on and so forth, until one of them, or as it happens many times, both of them at the same time make the final recollection. And so the idea is that on the basis of those processes of communication, they manage to navigate a certain memory trace and recall a piece of information that none of them could have recalled were they to try and remember on their own. And so, as Wegner and his colleagues at Harvard claim, those processes of communication can give rise to a knowledge acquiring, knowledge holding, and knowledge using system that is greater than the sum of its individual member systems. And so it is the kind of distributed cognitive system that can give rise to group knowledge. Now, apart from being interesting examples that can kind of illustrate what group knowledge is about, one more reason why I focus on them is because in both cases, it has also been suggested that what is required in practice in order to have a well-integrated distributed system is, first of all, that every member of the group possesses some common knowledge that will allow them to communicate and start building a relationship even as strangers, but at least with the sense that everyone knows something that everyone else knows, which will then allow them to build the differentiated structure of the community by revealing information about themselves, and so get a sense of who the other individual is, so that they will know when it is time for them to differ to the other individual's knowledge and expertise, and when it is time for them to take action themselves, which finally will allow them to start interacting with each other on the basis of processes of communication and interaction, which according to dynamical systems theory is the only theoretically necessary and sufficient condition in order to have a well-integrated system. So, on the basis of those two examples, we can also see what is required in practice to design and create such systems. But I also want to give you one more example, as I said, from web science, because in fact the web was initially created as a knowledge management system for CERN in Switzerland. And as its creator, Tim Berners-Lee says, despite its wide expansion over the last 2 decades and a half, it is still supposed to be very much a work in progress, the reason being that it has quite a long way to go until it can finally become an intimate, collaborative medium. And as Berners-Lee explains in several passages in his book, the reason why this is the case is because so far the web has been designed so that it can facilitate and help people to access information that just a few people post, whereas it should be redesigned so that it will make it possible for everyone to access it, to post information just as easily as they can access it. And so both be affected and affect the web in a mutual way. And the reason why this is important, Berners-Lee thinks, is because when we achieve that, then actually we will also manage to create what he calls social machines, which he defines by saying that they're web-driven processes in which the people do the creative work and the machine does the administration, and which will enable us to do things we just couldn't do before. Specifically, he says the idea is that if we efficiently design such social machines, then high-level activities like knowledge and justification, which have occurred just within one human's brain, will occur among even larger, more interconnected groups of people, acting as if they shared a larger intuitive brain. And again, they do seem the kind of distributed systems that can give rise to good knowledge. Now again, you might think this is some kind of sci-fi, but ever since Berners-Lee wrote these things 15 years ago, there have been several attempts towards building such social machines, and wikis, which allow people to collaboratively create content, have been very helpful. So obviously, it shouldn't be surprising that Wikipedia is a very good case, which according to a recent study, ever since 2004 and until 2007, it has experienced an exponential growth in the number of its active contributors, which are the contributors that didn't edit Wikipedia just once, but after the first time, they kept coming back. Now, the reason why I want to focus on Wikipedia, other than obviously being a very important example, is also that it faces a serious problem that I think can be solved by thinking in terms of group knowledge. So, to see what the problem is, ever since 2007, Wikipedia faces a steady decline in the number of its active contributors, or the driving force of Wikipedia. And as the rest of the study concludes on the basis of those graphs, and I don't have the time to go through them, but you can ask me later on, what those graphs demonstrate is that around 2006, and in order to prevent itself from being vandalized, and exactly because the amount of the content was huge, Wikipedia introduced some semi-automated and automated tools. And the irony is that even though those tools did prevent Wikipedia from being vandalized, they're also the reason why now there is this steady decline in the number of the active contributors. The reason being that newcomers did not at all appreciate having their entries rejected automatically by automated and semi-automated tools. And so they felt like they lost their time because no one explained to them how they could make the entries better. And so they didn't bother coming back so that they can become active contributors. Instead, in order for them to feel like they're being creative and that their effort is being recognized, obviously they should have been able to interact with the rest of the community that could give them feedback. that would allow them to make the entries better so that finally the entries could be posted online. Now, we might ask, was that something to be expected? And could Wikipedia have prevented this problem? And if we want to be strict about it, we might say that yes, because as Berners-Lee explains in his definition of a social machine, the machine aspect of the social machine is supposed to only be doing the administrative work, whereas the creative work must only be left for the human components. And obviously deciding which entries must stay and which entries must go is a very creative task. And so in order to solve this problem, Wikipedia must find a way to keep the quality of its content high despite the huge amount of data and without the use of bots. And the way to do this is obviously to find a way and allow its contributors to efficiently interact with each other, which is what I have been saying is needed in order to have a well-integrated system. And even though there might be several ways that Wikipedia can do that, I think that it can follow some general guidelines and specifically try and implement the two properties that I mentioned are in practice required in order to have a well-integrated distributed system. And so I just close by giving you an example of how Wikipedia could implement these properties in its algorithm. And so one thing that it can do is, for instance, to ask every newcomer or every existing contributor to also register some areas of expertise that it can then use in order to more efficiently allocate the workload of editing Wikipedia by, for instance, sending notifications of a new entry only to those contributors that possess the relevant expertise. And at the same time, Wikipedia can keep a track of how many reversions a given editor's edits undergo over time, and if it is too many of them, try and record that editor's status of expertise on the relevant problematic domain. And the idea is that if Wikipedia manages to do that, then not only will it allow all contributors to efficiently interact with each other, but as the circle indicates, it will also manage to self-regulate by allowing the right contributors to keep monitoring each other, such that if there are any falsehood, vandalism, or mistakes posted, they will be very quickly spotted and automatically removed, which is very similar to the way we get justified within our own heads. So I'll stop here.